start with Ukraine because so much depends on what happens there. The war in Ukraine is now the main driver of what happens around the world in so many fields. It used to be the pandemic and now it's the war. It affects energy prices, and that in turn has been driving up prices of all kinds, and that feeds into inflation, and that then determines how much central banks raise interest rates, and that will determine whether we get recessions or not in 2023, and if we do, how deep they are. Also, the price of food is affected by the war. It's been driven up around the world. So a lot depends on what happens and how long the conflict continues for. What do we think is going to happen? We think there are likely to be further Ukrainian advances during 2023, but we think that a resolution of the conflict is unlikely. And why is that? Well, Vladimir Putin cannot win. He cannot get what he originally wanted, which was to take over the whole of Ukraine. So the best he can do now is to continue to not lose, to string out the conflict in the hope that something will change in his favour. There are three things he's hoping for. One in particular is breaking the will of the Ukrainian people by trying to destroy their infrastructure for electricity, heating and water, but that doesn't seem to be working. If anything, it's making the Ukrainian people more united and more determined to push the Russians out of their country. Another thing he might be hoping for is that cold weather in Europe and deep recessions in Europe will mean that European powers are less inclined to support Ukraine and to continue to fund Ukraine and send weapons. But I think most of all what he's hoping for is that Donald Trump will come back, and if Donald Trump wins the presidency in 2024, then America would withdraw its support for Ukraine, and America is the biggest supporter of Ukraine, both financially and with weapons. And of course, we know that Donald Trump has a history here. The phone call, the supposedly perfect phone call that led to his first impeachment, was with Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine. So ultimately then, we think it's in Vladimir Putin's interest to string out the conflict for as long as possible in the hope that one of these things changes. And the only alternative to that, we think, would be if Putin himself is removed from power within Russia. And we think that's quite unlikely. We asked the super forecaster team, and they said that the chances of this happening were about 10%, so only a 1 in 10 chance. So that suggests that the conflict's going to continue, the uncertainty is going to continue. And that brings us to our second theme, which is what happens with economies around the world. This means that we're going to see higher prices for longer. The inflation that we're seeing at the moment started as a result of the pandemic, but it's since been magnified by the conflict. So we've gone from worrying about spike proteins to worrying about spiking prices. Central banks have been raising rates faster than they have done in decades, and they've all been doing it at the same time. And the result is likely to be recessions in 2023 in many parts of the world. In America, we think a relatively mild recession. In Europe, a deep recession. And in Britain, a long recession that has probably already begun. But the pain will be global because high rates of interest in the US and a strong dollar have global impacts. Many countries' debts are denominated in dollars, so a stronger dollar makes life more difficult for them. But there is a silver lining in all of this, and I'm going to have 3 silver linings in my talk. The first silver lining is that the war has accelerated the switch to renewable energy in many parts of the world. Now, it's true that many countries are using more coal right now, but this is very much a stopgap measure while new renewables come on stream. It takes a minimum of about 2 years to get new solar and wind on stream, so we won't see that coming through until the end of 2023, probably at the earliest. But in Europe, we've now had 19 countries setting new records for their use of wind and solar energy since the war began. Fatih Birol of the International Energy Agency has called the conflict a turning point in the history of energy, and he says it will accelerate the clean energy transition. Basically, European nations don't want to be dependent anymore on Russian gas, so that means more investment in solar and wind, and many European countries have raised their targets for 2030 for the fraction of their electricity they want to get from renewable sources. It's not just solar and wind though, we're also going to see more nuclear power. That means keeping existing nuclear stations on for longer. It means building more new ones, but that takes a long time as well. And the other winner here is hydrogen. Hydrogen has a bad name because it doesn't really work very well if you try to use it to power cars, but it has a bright future in industrial uses for decarbonising steel making, cement making, and potentially aviation and shipping as well. However, we are starting to see, because so much extra money is flowing into these sorts of green technologies, arguments breaking out between Europe and America over whether the subsidies that they're providing are fair. I think this is a good problem to have when these sorts of arguments break out because of the size and the scale of green technology subsidies. I think that suggests that we're on the right path. Another topic I think we're going to be hearing a lot about in the coming year is peak China. In April, India will overtake China to become the world's most populous nation, with a population of about 1.43 billion people. China's population is aging and shrinking, and as you can see from this chart, its population will start to decline in 2023. Some people say it's already declining. What is true is that the workforce is shrinking and the whole population is aging, and the number of workers relative to retirees is getting smaller. And this makes sense. If you think about the one-child policy, it meant that in the 90s you might have had two parents with one dependent child, and now increasingly you've got two retirees with one worker trying to support them. Growth is also slowing because of Xi Jinping's zero-COVID policy and his crackdown on technology firms and the crisis in the property sector. So if you put all these things together, some people are saying that China's years of rapid catch-up growth may now be behind it. Just looking at the zero-COVID policy, by one estimate, China spent about 1.5% of GDP, or about $250 billion, on COVID testing in 2022. As a result of all of this, some people are now saying that China may now never overtake America in the size of its economy. There are just some forecasts saying this, and obviously predicting GDP this far into the future is a dangerous thing to do. But remember what happened with Japan. In the 1980s, people said its economy would overtake America's, and it never did. But I think there's another silver lining here for Western powers and democracies around the world, which is the problems that China's been having and the fact that India is going to grow faster during 2023 really, I think, undermines the idea that the Chinese model is a viable alternative to democratic capitalism. So the idea that you can trade some human rights, but in return you get a stable society, the state looks after you, and you get more rapid growth, that's obviously not the case anymore. China is not keeping those promises. But the question is, will a slower growing, weaker China be a more dangerous China? And we'll come back to that question in a moment. On to America. Republicans took the House in the midterms, so America now has divided government. This is a recipe for gridlock and infighting. We'll see conflict both within and between the two main political parties, because they both have tiny majorities, and that gives very small numbers of politicians enormous power. Republicans will launch lots of investigations into Democrats and into Hunter Biden's laptop and all sorts of nonsense like that. We're also going to see the cultural divides on guns, abortion, and the teaching of race and history in schools continuing to deepen. But as well as this fighting between the two parties, we're going to see conflict within the parties. Donald Trump has announced that he wants to be president again and is running in 2024, and this sets the scene for a bruising primary contest against Ron DeSantis in particular. Meanwhile, Joe Biden is also under pressure to say that he won't run again. Although he had good results in the midterms, people are saying to him he could get more done in his 2 remaining years as president if he announces that he's not going to run again. If he says he's retiring from the stage, then he might find it easier to get some Republicans to support bills in particular areas, such as bashing China and bashing big technology companies. And these are the two things that Republicans and Democrats are most likely to agree on. But bashing China could be dangerous, particularly if it raises tensions over Taiwan. And that brings us to the flashpoints to watch in 2023. Taiwan is the obvious one, and the big question is how Ukraine has changed the calculus for China. On the one hand, China might think that Europe and America are distracted by the conflict in Ukraine, so now might be a good time to make a move on Taiwan. On the other hand, Ukraine shows that size isn't everything, and a big power attacking a smaller power next door doesn't always go according to plan. Again, we asked the super forecasters, and they think there's only a 1 in 6 chance of shots being fired in anger across the Taiwan Strait in 2023. Instead, we think it's more likely that China might try to test America and its allies by saber-rattling in the East China Sea or in the South China Sea. But these aren't the only flashpoints to watch. India and China have a disputed border where there was a conflict in 2020 that killed 24 soldiers, and that could flare up again too. And closer to home, for me in Europe, is the possibility that there might be conflict between Turkey and Greece. The leaders of both countries face re-election, and the president of Turkey has talked about stealing islands from Greece in the past. So will he try it in 2023 in an effort to boost his re-election chances? If he does, that would mean a crisis for NATO because both Greece and Turkey are members of it. And that brings us to the whole question of alliances. Who's up and who's down? One way to map big political shifts at the moment is to look at which alliances people want to join and which ones they want to leave. In 2019, Emmanuel Macron told us that NATO was brain dead and that the European Union was on the edge of a precipice. But NATO has now been revitalised. Finland and Sweden both want to join in 2023, and Ukraine has applied to join the EU. And this, I think, leads us to the third silver lining of greater unity among Western powers and their allies, and a reminder of the importance of defending democracy. It doesn't just defend itself. This is why we can also see America shifting its attention away from the Middle East and towards its new alliances in Asia-Pacific. So the Quad, for example, which brings together the US, India, Japan and Australia, is suddenly more important, and so is AUKUS, which brings together Australia, the UK and America. Meanwhile, if you look at Russia's alliance, the CSTO, there's been bickering with that alliance, and Armenia refused to sign the declaration at the end of its most recent meeting. So judging by the health of alliances, the West is newly confident and authoritarianism is on the back foot. It will be interesting to see if this continues during 2023. Meanwhile, my favourite new alliance is called I2U2, which sounds like a rock band, but it is in fact a food security and clean energy forum that brings together Israel, India, the UAE and the US. This is an unusual group of countries, but it shows that concerns about food and energy security are universal and can transcend politics. Another trend is the return of tourism. Revenge tourism in particular. This is where travellers get their revenge on the coronavirus by taking the holidays that they were denied in 2020 and 2021. International tourist arrivals rose by 60% in 2022 and will rise by another 30% in 2023. And spending on tourism will almost regain its pre-pandemic level of $1.34 trillion. But the actual number of trips will be slightly lower at 1.6 billion compared with 1.8 billion in 2019. The spending is the same because of inflation. It's fewer trips, but each trip costs more, so you get back to the same total. Business travel remains weak, however, as firms cut costs, prepare for recession and use more video conferencing. And we saw this after 9/11 and the global financial crisis as well. Tourism bounced back, but business travel never returned to its previous level. And the same will be true in this case. But as the beaches and the sun loungers fill up again, this is a case where revenge is best served hot rather than cold. What about the Metaverse? Will the idea of working and playing in virtual worlds catch on beyond video games? We'll see in 2023. The big news, I think, will be Apple's first headset. As with smartphones, tablets and smartwatches, Apple's entry into the market may change the game. It will be interesting to see what Apple calls this market. Will it say Metaverse, or will it use another term like mixed reality or extended reality? We'll soon find out. Apple's headset will initially be aimed at developers to encourage them to create content so that when Apple launches a cheaper headset to consumers, probably in 2024 or 2025, there's already something for them to do. Meanwhile, Facebook renaming itself to Meta has, I think, set back the prospects for the Metaverse by confusing people. People who haven't heard of the Metaverse or aren't quite sure what it is are now more likely to think that it's some kind of proprietary product from Facebook, which it isn't. There are lots of companies trying to push this idea, not just Meta or Facebook. We'll see whether Meta sticks with its bet on the Metaverse as its share price languages. One thing we can be sure of is that it's going to add legs to avatars in its version of the Metaverse during 2023. The real question is not whether the Metaverse has legs literally, but whether it has legs metaphorically. Will people want to use it? Another shift that I think could be much more significant during 2023 is the prospect of being able to get rid of passwords and replace them with passkeys. These are digital keys protected by biometrics that cannot be guessed, forgotten or stolen. And you use them to log into apps or websites essentially by, if your phone or your computer is nearby, you click and it just asks to confirm that it's you by unlocking your phone. You can already use this on some websites, but you do need the latest version of all the software on your phone and on your computer. And as more people upgrade during 2023, I think this technology will become far more widespread. This could dramatically reduce cybercrime because it makes phishing attacks almost impossible. And passkeys is just one of many new terms for 2023 that we think it's worth learning. In 2020 and 2021, we all had to learn lots of new words to do with immunology and vaccinology. In 2022, we have been learning new words to do with military hardware and conflict. And in 2023, I think there's going to be more of the same, more military terms, more environmental terms, and also, of course, more technological terms, because technology never stops. Cryptocurrencies have fallen from favour, but post-quantum cryptography is in, and something you need to learn about if you don't know what it is. Another example is productivity paranoia. This is where workers and managers disagree on the effectiveness of working remotely. According to a survey by Microsoft, 87% of remote workers said they were just as effective and just as productive at home, but only 12% of bosses agreed. The result is distrust and paranoia. The workers worry that the bosses think that they're shirking, and the bosses worry that their workers are shirking. And the result then is productivity theatre, which is sort of performative work where you reply to every email straight away by saying, okay, thank you, so that it looks like you're doing work all the time. Anyway, we have 23 of these new terms for 2023 that we think you'll need to know, and you can find them on our website. In retrospect, the pandemic marked the end of a period of relative stability in politics and economics. Today's world is much more unstable. It's convulsed by the unpredictability of geopolitics, the aftershocks of the pandemic, economic upheaval, extreme weather events, and rapid social and technological change. Unpredictability is the new normal, and there's no getting away from it. So I wish you the best of luck in navigating the ups and downs of 2023. Thanks for listening, and now let's go to Q&A.
Well, Tom, thank you very much for always bringing this.
谢谢把这么多的新的趋势介绍给我们，但是我们现在已经没有时间进行 Q&A 了。
没有办法，跟在远端的 Tom， 而且是 early morning 在伦敦进行 Q&A。但是很重要的，他讲的2023 The World Ahead 全球经济大趋势，繁体中文版事实上已经出版了。如果你还没有阅读，又想要进一步了解 Tom 的论述，可以看看那一本杂志，非常的丰富。谢谢各位。